Today's Jolly Lark is showing you how to paint quickly and efficiently using washes and one color highlighting and shading. All right, howdy everyone. For today's Jolly Lark, we are going to be painting some of these Blood and Plunder pirates. Just gave this game a shot and it's been a good time so far. It's a fun little skirmish game, a little different than some of the other games I've been playing, but lots of fun. So to start this lark, what I've done here is zenithal primed the miniature, which just means priming it black, followed by a light overspray of white on top. And then after that, to get it ready to put some color on, I've washed the whole thing with a Nuln Oil gloss. The Nuln Oil gloss gives a nice finish for the contrast paints that I'm going to use next. And it creates our margin of error. So all these deep black lines in between the areas of detail, those are going to be kind of our zones where we can slip up a little bit, slop the paint around, and generally paint these quickly and in a game-ready fashion. These are not going to be competition miniatures, just a quick, fun little project. So whenever I'm trying to paint a miniature quickly, there's always two things to keep in mind. You want to go inside to out, which means painting the things like the skin before painting things that are on top, because it's easier to paint something, an area that's on top of another area. Similarly, we'll paint the coat before we paint the belt, for example, and roughly going light to dark. So if you put the lighter colors on first and then you layer darker colors on top of that, it's easier to cover up mistakes. So to start with, I always try to go light to dark, and then inside to out rather, and then also light to dark. So as a first step, we're going to hit the flesh tones with a little bit of Citadel contrast Guilliman flesh. And because of that Nuln Oil layer that we put on first, we don't have to be super careful with this. If the black Nuln Oil wash will hide a lot of the errors, as long as you're not getting the paint too much into other areas, it's not that big a deal. And even here, like on the wood of the gun, if we got a little bit of flesh color onto the gun area, it's okay. You know, the gun's gonna be brown. I'm gonna painting 25 of these pirates in a batch here, and we're gonna shoot for a variety of skin tones because these are pirates from all over the world. They're spending a lot of time out in the sun. You're probably not gonna get too many super pale complexions, but the Guilliman flesh is a nice base coat for anything. That red layer is good. So I'm shooting here again, because I'm trying to paint these quickly, getting a little bit of natural contrast by putting on more of the Guilliman flesh on the lower half of his face than on the upper half of the face, which gives a little bit of a natural highlight. All right. One little spot on the fingers that I missed on the underside, and there's actually going to be a step later where any underside things that we've missed won't be that big a deal. All right, I'm going to use two other colors in this step. I'm going to use the contrast Griff Charger Gray, which is a nice kind of pale, dull blue, which I think will be a good for a sun-bleached blue fabric. I'm definitely not a historian, but it seems like blue is a relatively basic color. You see a lot of blue. There's a reason, denim basic clothing is blue. These basic run-of-the-mill buccaneers are not going to be wearing a lot of fancy, deep purples and vermilions and fancy colors. We'll stick with some basic browns, grays, blues, splash of some brighter colors for ribbons and stuff like that. We'll give these a little hodgepodgey, and these miniatures from Firelock Games' Blood and Plunder game, really fun little game. The miniatures have a lot of character. They don't necessarily have the same level of detail that you'd expect from, say, a Citadel miniature, but that's okay. They're fun. I've been enjoying playing the game. So next step, we're going to pull out some Mechanicum Gray. That gives us a gray contrast paint. It's a kind of medium gray contrast paint that we'll use for the pants and his woolen cap. And as long you can do multiple, I find it easier to get a couple of colors out at the same time. Put a couple different colors on the miniature all at the same time, rather than going back and forth and doing all the gray on a single figure and then switching hands. I think the fewer times you have to pick up and put down a figure, the better. So we'll get his woolen cap, be gray, pants are gray, coat is a light blue. And actually, while we've got him here, I'm gonna give him a little bit of a blue tint on his stockings here too, just to add another little bit of color. That may get covered up by some brown washes later, but I'll give a little bit of color to there. And that's it for that stage. The next stage I'm gonna do is gonna involve areas that touch the contrast that I dusted. So I'm gonna let this one dry for just a minute, and then we'll come back and put on some browns. All right, we're back with our pirate here. For next step, we're gonna put on some browns. And what I've done here down on the palette is served up some Cygor brown, some skeleton horde, some gore grunt of fur, and wildwood, all Citadel contrast paints. And when I'm doing miniatures, fantasy miniatures, or historical miniatures that I might want to look a little bit more varied or realistic, their uniforms aren't all coming from the same factory, I'm gonna kind of mix and match these browns. It's okay if one gun barrel is a little lighter than the other, or one leather strap is redder than the other is fine. And I've also served up a little dollop of contrast medium that I'll use sometimes to lighten a color as I'm doing it. So as you'll see, I'm gonna be going back and forth from my palette to the miniature quite a bit, kind of just popping in and out the different colors of browns. So let's get started with these browns here, and we'll just kind of put them on and see what we get. What we're gonna do, I just grabbed the first one. This is the gore grunt of fur. That's a little more reddish. Totally fine on the musket barrel. And again, because we're going inside out, I'm not worried too much if we're getting these on the bits that are going to be steel later, because the steel is going to cover that up. A big part of being able to paint quickly is also knowing when it's okay to make mistakes. I want to be careful not to get this color on any of the colors I've already put down, and I don't want to slop it everywhere. But it's okay if it gets a little bit on areas you haven't painted yet, or areas that you know you're going to paint over with an opaque color later. So I think I want that brown on this one to be distinctive. So I'm going to switch over to maybe the skeleton horde for some of make some of his leather straps kind of a lighter sun-tanned natural leather color. One of the other things I like about having put a Nuln Oil wash on before the color goes on, I feel like it gives a little bit better lightness to the colors in the highlights. I think it makes the highlights look a little bit better than when you put the black on top. Maybe that's my imagination, but that's my sense of things. We're gonna be painting this miniature with probably 90% contrast, but there's a trick to getting the highlights looking good that we'll jump to in a minute. I think that's looking pretty good for those lighter leathers. I basically like that. Might, while this is here, grab just a little bit on my palette, just grabbing a little bit of the Cygor brown, which is a really nice medium brown. Put a little bit of that, mix it up a little bit in here. I also will sometimes with the browns, these pants get dirty, I'll just kind of put a little brown on the pants, grab a little water on my brush, kind of feather it out. Put a little brown on, feather it out, grab a little more pure brown. So kind of just putting some of that brown in there. Feather it out with a little bit of water. The contrast paints are really easy to do. It's not anything fancy like wet blending or anything. It's just kind of smushing some color up where it might look a little dirtier. You gotta put some pit stains in there, all that good stuff. All right. So for we've got the wildwood here. The wildwood is a super dark brown, like it's almost a blackish brown. I use it pretty sparingly, and I usually dilute it with some contrast medium. We'll make his scabbard that darker brown. And I'm gonna grab some a little more undiluted wildwood brown to hit his shoes with that. Some of these guys are gonna have black shoes. Some will have white shoes. You can see here I'm working pretty quickly, but actually, if I was doing this not on a video, thank you all for watching my first video here, I would be going even a little faster. So we got some nice brown shoes. And at this point, as you can see, let's make the hilt of his sword. Put some brown leather in there. And at this point, we're gonna leave his shirt white. See there. And he's getting pretty close. We basically got the contrast colors we want on. Take a little bit of this medium brown and we add it into the cracks here. Almost for a little bit of a dirt and mud and weathering. Just goes a little bit of tonal variation. We're gonna come back in and do a little bit more of that later. But you wanna, when you're adding a darker color in, like I'm adding a little bit of this brown on top of the blue for a little bit of shading. And what we're doing here, you wanna still make sure you're adding those darker colors on the areas where the shadow. And then, and you see the contrast paint dries pretty quickly. So got that going on. I basically have that. I'm gonna add a little bit more skeleton horde to some of these areas of the light leather that are underneath, like where the shadow of his gun would fall right there. So I'm just gonna add another layer of skeleton horde to the lower areas. It's the exact same color I put on before. It's just darkening it up a little bit. All right. That looks good. All right. So the next step is my favorite step in the speed painting, kind of fast painting process, and that's putting on a universal layer of highlights. Now, the normal, White Dwarf GW way of putting on highlights is to put on the highlight with a lighter version of the color that you're using. What I like to do is use this paint, which I really love from Monument Hobbies. That's a Monument Hobbies Bright Ivory. You can see here I've diluted it with a little bit of medium. It's pretty thin, but I'm still getting some decent coverage. One of the things I like about the Pro Acryl paints. So what I'm going to do, it's this nice bright, very bright yellow. So I'm going to come in and relatively quickly, and because I want this guy to look a little bit more realistic per se, I'm just going to quick in and I'm going to highlight every single color that I've done so far with the same bright ivory. So going over the raised parts, I'm basically only hitting the surfaces that are facing the viewer as you're looking at the model. I'm going to try to quickly put in a little bit of kind of faux wood grain, just some little stripiness on the handle. It's okay if it's a little messy because it's going to get largely covered up. So hitting the highlights again on every color, hitting the folds on the fabric. Now on the leather here, I'm going to be a little bit messier and intentionally try to add a little bit of scratchiness. And you're just kind of going, you're painting for, this is a miniature I'm painting for a game. You're looking for the impression of highlights. This is not a competition miniature. Hit the tips of the fingers here. I haven't even changed brushes. As you might have noticed, I'm still using the same Monument Bombwick brush, which is pointy enough to do what I want to do. I'm going to do the ribbing on this miniature's hat is not super accentuated, so I'm just going to give some quick vertical strokes around the brim of the hat to kind of simulate a little more ribbing than is actually sculpted there. And with the woolen knit cap, I'm gonna intentionally do some little bit of kind of cross hatching highlights to give the impression of a knit texture. It'll do a bright highlight. And you'll notice that this is thin enough that it's not full coverage. I'm not putting on pure white paint here. And in fact, it's thin enough that on some of the spots, like this top of his thigh here, I'm actually gonna go in and I'm gonna highlight it again. I'm gonna put another coat while I'm here, and you can see how it's lightening up the previous highlight. I'm gonna do that over here on the gun. Just a little pin highlight here, a little bit more of this wood grain pattern. Come in on the tops, the folds, give those another highlight. A little bit on the leather. His shirt's gonna stay white, creamy colored. And again, this is homespun, fantasy, historical fabrics. These are not factory-made silken garments. This guy's not royalty. It's okay if the fabric looks a little rough. In fact, maybe it's better if the fabric looks a little rough. I'm gonna put some highlights, back of his heel there, edge of his scabbard. So that's what I mean when I talk about universal highlights, but another quick highlight on the top of his wrist there. And I've basically highlighted the entire miniature. Quick pop on the lips. Highlighted the entire miniature with the same color. Looks nice and bright, and that's really made a difference. If you skip back to the beginning of the video, just that quick highlight layer, highlighted every color on the miniature in the exact same paint color. And then next, what we're gonna do is shade the entire miniature in the exact same shade. So to do that, I'm gonna take the Citadel Contrast Leviathan Blue, and with the puddle of contrast medium that I still have left from the previous step, I'm gonna put out a little of this. And so here's what I do here. As I grab, kind of see what I'm doing on the palette down here. It's a little out of focus, but that's okay. And I grab a little bit of this Leviathan Blue and paint it on here. As you can see, it's kind of a dark midnighty shade. And I'm almost going for like a comic booky shading. I'm gonna shove some of this into the areas that are gonna be where shadows would fall. Shadow light tends to be pretty blue. You notice that sometimes. I really like this effect of actually painting in some blue shadows. And we're just kind of quickly gonna go in the areas that would be a little more shadowed. Back of his head, underside of his gun. You can kind of cheat. I'm using the Leviathan Blue water mixed with a little bit of contrast medium now. If you turn the miniature upside down, kind of the undersides of things look good if they get a little hint of blue. The insides of folds, underside of his arm here, anything that's inside a crack or a crevice. And you end up with this little bit of a bruising effect that I really like the look of. I think it gives a naturalistic effect to the miniatures. Post some pictures. I did a Sons of Behemat army for Age of Sigmar recently, where I used this effect throughout the whole army. I was pleased with that. So again, I'm just kind of putting a little bit more of this blue color into all the shadows. You can water it down a little further if it's a stronger effect than you want, or you can even skip this stage, and the Nuln Oil will have given you some of this effect already. I'm gonna push the tip of the brush in here to get a little bit of this blue into these deep areas on top that did get hit with the lighter primer layer, but probably should be a little darker. And let's say it again, game ready models. It's okay if they're a little messy. If you get a line here at the edge that's a little sharper than you want, just fade it, dip your brush in some water, fade it back out. I'm gonna put a slight blush of blue, just a slight, the underside of his face. And I just can't stress enough how much time this saves to basically shade and highlight the miniature all with the same colors. right, you saw how fast that was? And then what we're gonna do is come back, and I would do all this for all the miniatures at the same time. I still got the white here on my palette. I'm gonna, having done this, you may see an area that you want a little bit more contrast on. Just add a little highlight, no problem. I would get all the miniatures to this stage, and then we're gonna go back and hit all the colors again with exactly the same colors or similar colors that we did before. And you'll see how that kind of smooths out the shadows and the highlights and gives it a cohesive look. Oh, and actually while we're here, let's go ahead and hit the bases. The bases on these Blood and Plunder figures all have these cool plank bases. I'm gonna hit the base with, this is the Cygor brown. You can see what I did here is I blobbed a little bit of the Cygor brown on the base, and I'm just spreading it out with some water. That gives a little bit of a natural tonal variation, which I kind of like on the wood. That was just a blob of Cygor brown here, and then spread out with a little water. Cool. All right, so all the colors here have dried, all the washes have dried. A little bit of shininess you may see in the cracks is due to having used the Nuln Oil gloss to start with. If that bothers you, you can skip the Nuln Oil gloss, and I just use regular Nuln Oil. But like I said, I like the texture that the Nuln Oil gloss gives you for washing. So basically what we're gonna do now is come in and just repeat those same first steps, putting on the same colors, the Gryph-Charger Gray, the Mechanicum Gray, and the same browns we used before. Gonna take the exact same colors we used before and re-wash this areas with the exact same color. This will pull the highlights together and pull the shadows and any other browns we put on there together. Depending on how intense the color is, at this stage you may want to water down the contrast color a little bit so that you're getting a lighter wash. That's not necessarily necessary with the Gryph-Charger Gray I just used because it's already a light color. But with the Basilicum Gray, definitely I'm going to grab a little bit of contrast medium over here and lighten this up, because the Basilicanum Gray is a pretty dark color. So this wash I'm doing on the pants here, it's probably about 50-50 gray and contrast medium. You can always grab a little more of the pure gray if you want to darken anything up. All right, so that's the Gryph-Charger Gray. Let's go back to our browns. I'm gonna get the Skeleton Horde again to put onto the leathers, the lighter colored leathers. You can see here it's just blending in those highlights and shadows. Go easy on it on the upper areas. Let's grab that red Gore-Grunter that we used. It's also a very strong color, so I'm definitely diluting that on my palette with some contrast medium. And then we'll go over these wood areas again. The more layers you put on the wood grain, the more realistic effect you'll get. But at this stage, for these models, where I just kind of want them ready to play with friends, I'm gonna probably just leave the wood grain at that one layer. We'll do another video later on painting wood grain effects. Did that a lot with my Sons of Behemoth army. All right, and then now we'll give the skin tones another real quick wash. Just grab a little bit of that paint, mix it with a little contrast medium. I don't worry that much about keeping my mediums and stuff clean. While I'm painting, I serve up a little bit of them and then don't worry about it too much, because I kind of like the effect if the colors get a little blended. I feel like it helps the miniatures look like the colors belong with each other. Maybe that's just an excuse for me being lazy. But hit the skin again. So about this fast, we'll hit the boots again with the watered down wildwood. Especially on that heel where we added a sharp highlight. You can see how anytime I have a little bit too much paint, All right. Notice that the collar of his shirt got a little more blue on it than I wanted, so I'm just going to just grab a little bit of the white I had here. I'm just going to hit the edges of his collar and his shirt here with a little bit of white and draw that white line a little more sharply across his back. Okay, and then we'll come back, do another coat of basilicum gray, watered down with a little contrast medium on his hat again. Those highlights are a little aggressive on some parts of his hat. I'm trying to darken up the lower areas, leave the lighter areas a little higher. All right, that looks good to me. We're pretty close to done here, folks. All right, and now we are into painting the metallics. So the way I paint metallics is I start by giving all the areas that I want to be metal. Well, this is how I paint metallics on miniatures that I want to paint quickly. I start by painting the areas that I want to be metallic black, basically re-base coating them. It just gives a nice layer for the actually metallic paint to sit on, because sometimes they can be a little translucent. So the metals on this figure are the gun barrel, and so there's a couple of buckles and stuff. The hilt of the sword, and I probably, because I'm just trying to go quick and easy with this, probably will just use the same metal color on all the metals. Because metals are so reflective, metals that are in shadows really don't shine much at all. So another reason I like to get it black to start with, so that paint the buckle a little more carefully here. Just outlining that in black. There's another buckle up here. Give that a quick hit of black. Buckle under here, and that's it. So, missed a little spot here on his hand, between his hands, come in from above here. Okay, all right, and then while that black dries, my go-to color for basically all quick metals is this Pro Acryl white gold. It's like a warm silver. It doesn't, to me, it still reads as silver on the miniatures, but given that sunlight is a little bit yellow, I like the little bit yellow tinge that this has. It definitely doesn't read as bronze or gold at all. It's called white gold, but I use it as kind of my go-to starting point for silvers usually. And part of the reason I like that is that it's not quite as bright as their bright silver color is. And I feel like it gives you a little bit of a place to go too. If you want to highlight this with their metallic medium or shade it with another layer of contrast paint, you can. It's not blazing bright. I don't think it looks out of place on a historical miniature. Paint the mechanism here. And just remember the whole time you're doing this, what you're shooting for is the impression when you're talking about gaming miniatures. You know, it's almost a little bit impressionistic of what you're doing. You're shooting for the impression of soldiers on the battlefield. You're generally looking at these from feet away while you're playing. And I think of, when I'm painting a project like this, I kind of think of the whole group as the project. This miniature isn't the project. All the miniatures, the 25 miniatures that came in the starter set that I'm working on, that's the project. You know, it's like there's 25 parts of one miniature. The whole force is the project. So we're just hitting tops and edges of the metal parts. Again, that'll give a good impression of shiny metal and relieve the more recessed parts black. Hit the top tip of his scabbard with a little bit of metal. And something that if you've, like me, been mostly painting Games Workshop figures, sometimes you'll be surprised by how fast and easy other companies' miniatures are to paint when they're not loaded with so much detail. And that detail is awesome, but every bit of detail also makes it a little bit harder to paint. So at this stage, I kind of give the model a look, see if there's anything that's bothering me. There's a little bit of blue on this leather strap that I don't love. Just cover that up with a little bit of a highlight. Looks fine. Match the highlight here. I think I want the edge of this gun stock to have a little bit lighter. I'm just going to hit that a little tap, tap, tap on the edges, and I'll run a quick little line of white, watered down white on the edge. Maybe give this another little highlight up here. That'll represent like a glossy gun. Okay, I've been, so far the only brush I've used is this size 3 Bombwick brush from Monument. But I am, for painting the eyes real quick, going to switch to a thinner brush. So what did I grab? So an old kind of non-Winsor Newton sable. But it's got a nice tip. So the way I paint eyes is I paint a little bit of white into the eye socket. Get a little more paint on my brush. Put a little bit of white in the eye socket. And then I'm going to come in. I'll add a black dot in the middle. And that's usually enough to give the impression of an eye. You can totally skip this step if you want. Not a problem if their eyes are a little shaded. Cool. Got a little white in the sockets. I've still got some black on my palette from painting the guns. So with this, just kick the white off my brush, get a tip back. Pop a quick dot of black into the middle of each eye socket. Sometimes it's easier to do upside down because of the brow ridge. If it looks even upside down, probably will look okay right side up. That looks fine to me. Be fine to leave it here. I do get a little fiddly with the eyes, so I'm going to put a tiny little dot of ivory into the corner here just to brighten up his right eye. Not even sure you're going to see that in the video. That looks a little better to me. Okay. I think we're going to put a little more work on the base. Add a little bit more wood grain onto the base. I'll highlight the base a minute. Kind of just cartoonishly, kind of exaggerated streakiness to the wood. It'll look good when it's highlighted, when it's washed again later. Probably grab some skeleton horde for that. That combined with a wash will give some kind of natural highlights to the base. You can see, even as this is drying, because this is a real translucent layer of white, you can go over it again, add a little more variation to those white streaks. This is fast and messy. I didn't even switch brushes. I'm still using my eyeball brush. That's fine. That's it. Let that dry. We'll give the base another wash. Call this fella done. All right, the white should have dried on the base by now. It's just a minute or two. So I'm going to come back in with some skeleton horde, which is a lighter yellow-brown contrast paint, and just give this base super quick wash with this to get that brown effect in there. And I'm not 100% sold on this base yet. Could maybe try dry brushing this with a little bit of white. Might come in, add a little more dark brown. I wish the wood details on these bases were a little more sharply sculpted. I think it would be a little bit easier to paint and differentiate. Come back in with a little bit of watered down, darker brown. Skeleton Horde's not quite giving the effect I want, but I think the mix of the two will do the trick. And actually, while I'm here with the Skeleton Horde, just put a dab on this mistake I fixed earlier. All right, paint the edge of the base with, after that all dries, we'll call that guy a project. Got 1 down, 24 left to go. And we'll post some pictures of the whole thing when it's done, but that's my basic method for painting a miniature quickly and easily. Fast and loose, nice and easy, fun little project.